Everything you think you know about why people behave the way they do is probably wrong. Not a little wrong. Fundamentally, embarrassingly, completely wrong. Over the last decade, behavioral psychologists have quietly dismantled almost every popular assumption about human nature, and what they found underneath is stranger, darker, and more fascinating than any self-help book ever dared to admit. A recent meta-analysis across 47 universities found that the average person misidentifies the true motivation behind someone else's behavior, roughly 80% of the time. 80%. That means 4 out of every 5 judgments you make about the people around you, your partner, your boss, your best friend, are built on a foundation of complete fiction. And the wildest part is, you're not even doing it on purpose. Your brain is doing it for you, automatically, silently, and with total confidence. Here's the thing about human behavior. It almost never means what it looks like on the surface. Someone who talks too much at dinner isn't necessarily confident. Someone who goes quiet during an argument isn't necessarily calm. Someone who smiles at a funeral isn't necessarily heartless. The psychology underneath is almost always running a completely different program than the one you see on the outside. And once you learn to read that program, everything about the way you interact with people changes. Not a little. Everything. So let's start with one that catches almost everyone off guard. When someone constantly puts themselves down in front of you, calling themselves stupid, ugly, worthless, the instinct is to assume they have low self-esteem. Makes sense, right? But here's what clinical psychologists discovered when they actually tested this in controlled settings. In roughly 60% of cases, chronic self-deprecation is not a sign of low self-esteem at all. It's a social strategy. The person is preemptively lowering expectations so they can never truly fail in your eyes. If they tell you they're terrible at something and then do it even slightly well, they win. If they do it badly, well, they warned you. It's a psychological safety net disguised as vulnerability. Pretty clever, right? But also pretty exhausting for the people around them, because every compliment you offer gets deflected. Every reassurance bounces off, and eventually you start to feel like nothing you say matters. Which, ironically, is exactly the dynamic that erodes real relationships. But that's not even the strangest part, and patterns like that are exactly why understanding your own psychology matters so much. Because many of the behaviors we interpret as vulnerability are actually protective strategies our minds develop to avoid rejection, failure, or shame. Shadow work is about recognizing those hidden strategies inside yourself, so they stop running your life unconsciously. If you're curious to go deeper and consciously integrate your shadows and your light, check out the SIM Method ebook. It's a concise guide that can help you unlock your inner power in just 5 minutes a day. The link is in the first pinned comment below. Now that connects to something even more counterintuitive. If someone lies to you frequently, even about small things, the weather, what they had for lunch, whether they watched that show you recommended, the common assumption is that they're a bad person. Dishonest. Untrustworthy. But psychology tells a different story. Chronic lying, especially about trivial matters, is almost always a signal that the person is hiding something much larger. Not necessarily something dramatic like an affair or a crime, though sometimes it is. More often, they're hiding a version of themselves they believe you won't accept. The small lies aren't the problem. They're the smoke. The fire is a deep, often unconscious shame about who they really are. Researchers at the University of Massachusetts found that people who lie frequently in casual conversation report significantly higher levels of internal conflict and identity fragmentation than people who lie rarely. The lying isn't about deception. It's about protection. They're building a wall of small fictions to keep you from ever getting close enough to see the thing they think would make you leave. And that wall is more common than you'd think, because it shows up in a behavior most people find incredibly annoying but never bother to look underneath. Gossip. If someone in your life gossips constantly, talking about other people's failures, relationships, mistakes, the easy conclusion is that they're mean-spirited or bored. But behavioral research suggests something far more revealing. Chronic gossip is one of the strongest indicators that a person lacks a clear sense of personal direction. Think about it like this. When you're deeply engaged in building something, a career, a relationship, a project, a skill, you simply don't have the mental bandwidth to obsess over what other people are doing. Your attention is consumed by your own trajectory, But when that trajectory is unclear, when someone doesn't know where they're going or what they want, the brain does something fascinating. It redirects all that unused analytical energy outward. Suddenly, everyone else's life becomes incredibly interesting. Not because the gossiper is malicious, but because analyzing other people's choices is the brain's way of trying to figure out its own. It's like a compass searching for north by watching which direction everyone else is walking. Researchers at the University of Groningen actually quantified this and found that individuals with clearly defined personal goals engage in gossip roughly 70% less frequently than those without. The correlation was so strong, it held across every demographic they tested. But here's where this gets personal. Let's talk about sleep, because this one is going to make you look at someone in your life very differently. If someone is sleeping excessively, 10, 12, 14 hours a day, and they don't have an obvious medical condition, the surface-level assumption is that they're lazy. But neuroscience has revealed something that completely reframes this behavior. Excessive sleep, what researchers call hypersomnia when it becomes chronic, is one of the most reliable behavioral markers of reality avoidance. The brain, when overwhelmed by circumstances it cannot control or emotions it cannot process, essentially hits the emergency shutdown button. Sleep becomes an escape hatch. Not because the person is tired in the physical sense, but because consciousness itself has become painful. Every waking hour requires engagement with a reality that feels unmanageable, and the brain's most primitive solution is simply to reduce the number of waking hours. Studies from the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine found that people experiencing major life transitions, job loss, divorce, grief, identity crises, showed a 43% increase in total sleep time, even when their physical activity levels dropped. Their bodies needed less sleep. Their minds demanded more. The person sleeping 14 hours isn't lazy. They're in psychological retreat. And that retreat connects to something most people never think to question. Have you ever noticed that some people can't sit in silence? They need the television on, music playing, a podcast in their ears, conversation happening, anything to fill the quiet. The assumption is that they just prefer noise. Maybe they're extroverts. Maybe they like background sound. But cognitive psychologists have identified this as one of the clearest signs of unprocessed emotional material. Silence is dangerous for these people, not because it's boring, but because silence is where thoughts live. And when you have thoughts you haven't dealt with, grief you haven't processed, anger you haven't expressed, fear you haven't confronted, silence becomes a room full of everything you've been running from. The constant noise isn't a preference, it's a barricade. One researcher at Stanford described it as the psychological equivalent of keeping all the lights on in a house because you're afraid of what's hiding in the dark rooms. The noise doesn't fix anything. It just makes sure you never have to look. And speaking of things people avoid looking at, let's talk about anger. Specifically, the person who explodes over tiny things. The coffee is too cold. The traffic light took too long. Someone used the wrong tone in a text message. The popular explanation is that they have anger issues or a short fuse. But here's what the research actually shows. Disproportionate anger, anger that is wildly out of scale with the situation, is almost never about the situation. It's accumulated. Psychologists call this displaced aggression, and it works like a pressure cooker. Every unspoken frustration, every swallowed insult, every moment of powerlessness gets compressed into a smaller and smaller psychological space. Then some tiny, irrelevant trigger provides the one crack that pressure needs, and everything comes out at once. The person screaming about cold coffee isn't angry about coffee. They're angry about the promotion they didn't get 3 months ago, the argument they lost with their partner last week, the boundary they failed to set with their mother 10 years ago. The coffee just happened to be standing there when the dam broke. Simple math, really. Except the person on the receiving end never sees the equation, only the explosion. Now, this next one is going to make you rethink almost every romantic relationship you've ever observed. When someone falls in love extremely fast, like within days of meeting someone, declaring soulmate status, planning a future together, the romantic interpretation is that they felt an extraordinary connection. Love at first sight. Destiny. But attachment theorists have been studying this for decades, and the data tells a completely different story. Rapid romantic attachment is one of the strongest predictors of anxious attachment style, which means the person isn't responding to the specific qualities of their new partner. They're responding to the relief of not being alone. The speed isn't passion, it's panic. Their nervous system has been in a state of low-grade alarm since the last relationship ended, possibly since childhood, and the new person represents safety, not because of who they are, but because of what they represent, the end of that alarm. This is why relationships that start at lightning speed so often crash at the same velocity. The foundation was never about the two people. It was about one person's desperate need for emotional shelter. Pretty devastating when you think about it, right? But it doesn't stop there. Here's one that applies to nearly every long-term relationship on the planet. If your partner suddenly starts picking fights about nothing, criticizing your driving, complaining about how you load the dishwasher, getting irritated by the way you breathe, the surface reading is that they're becoming difficult or that the relationship is deteriorating. Sometimes that's true, but in a significant number of cases, the real dynamic is the exact opposite. They're creating conflict because they need emotional closeness, but don't know how to ask for it. Sounds crazy, right? But think about what happens during an argument. Walls come down. Emotions surface. Vulnerability appears, even if it's wrapped in frustration. For people who never learned healthy ways to express emotional needs, conflict becomes the only reliable pathway to genuine connection. They're not pushing you away. They're trying to pull you closer using the only tool they have. Relationship therapists see this so frequently they have a name for it: protest behavior. And the tragedy is that it almost always achieves the opposite of what the person actually wants. This is where things get tricky, because that pulling behavior is closely related to something much more subtle. When someone gives you the silent treatment, refusing to speak, walking away, shutting down completely during a disagreement, the common assumption is that they're punishing you. And sometimes they are. But neuroscience has shown that for many people, the silent treatment isn't a choice at all. It's a neurological event. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, can become so overwhelmed during emotional conflict that it essentially hijacks the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for speech, logic, and rational thought. The person isn't choosing silence. Their brain has literally shut down the verbal processing center as a survival response. They couldn't form a coherent sentence if they tried. Therapists call this a freeze response, and it's the same neurological mechanism that causes a deer to stop moving when it sees headlights. Not a strategy, a shutdown. And the worst part is that their partner, reading the silence as punishment, often escalates the conflict, which only drives the amygdala further into overdrive. Like pouring gasoline on a circuit that's already blown. And here's another one that will change the way you look at the people closest to you. If someone rarely asks for help, even when they're clearly struggling, the assumption is that they're strong, independent, self-sufficient. We admire it. We praise it. We say things like, "She's so tough, she never needs anyone." But clinical psychology has identified this pattern as one of the most common manifestations of early childhood emotional neglect. Children who learned that their needs would not be met, either because caregivers were absent, overwhelmed, or dismissive, develop a deeply encoded belief that asking for help is fundamentally unsafe. Not just uncomfortable. Unsafe. Their nervous system treats vulnerability the same way it would treat a physical threat. So they handle everything alone. Not because they can, but because at a neurological level, they believe they have to. The strength everyone admires is actually a scar. And the cruelest part is that the more people praise their independence, the deeper that scar gets buried. Nobody tells you about this one because it looks too much like a virtue. Now let's shift to something physical that most people completely misunderstand. If someone gets nosebleeds frequently, the typical response is to dismiss it. Dry air, allergies, nothing serious. But here's the thing about chronic nosebleeds that nobody tells you. While most are indeed harmless, recurrent nosebleeds are one of the most commonly ignored early warning signs of dangerously high blood pressure. The small blood vessels in the nasal septum are among the most fragile in the human body, and when blood pressure rises significantly, these vessels are often the first to rupture. A study published in the European Archives of Otorhinolaryngology found that patients presenting with recurrent epistaxis had a significantly higher prevalence of undiagnosed hypertension than the general population. Roughly 1 in 3 patients who came in for chronic nosebleeds were found to have blood pressure readings in the danger zone. That casual nosebleed that keeps coming back could be your body waving a red flag that something much more serious is building silently in the background. Never ignore it. Not once. But back to the psychological patterns, because there's one that affects nearly every workplace in the world. When someone is a perfectionist, obsessing over details, refusing to submit work that isn't flawless, redoing tasks multiple times, the surface interpretation is that they have high standards. They care about quality. They're dedicated. But perfection research, and yes, that's a real field with decades of data, has consistently shown that perfectionism is almost never about the work. It's about the self. Specifically, it's about a deep belief that their value as a human being is entirely conditional on their output. If the work is perfect, they deserve to exist. If the work has a flaw, they are the flaw. This is why perfectionists often experience devastating emotional responses to minor criticism. You're not critiquing their report. You're threatening their right to take up space in the world. The detail obsession isn't dedication. It's existential defense. And it's exhausting, not just for them, but for everyone waiting on the work that never feels good enough to release. Here's the thing about that defense mechanism, though. It's closely related to another behavior that shows up constantly in modern dating. When someone who seemed incredibly interested suddenly goes cold, stops texting, cancels plans, becomes emotionally unavailable, the assumption is that they lost interest. You did something wrong. They found someone better. But attachment research tells a very different story. In many cases, the person who pulls away is experiencing what psychologists call intimacy-triggered avoidance. As emotional closeness increases, their nervous system begins to register the connection as a threat. Not consciously. They're not sitting there thinking this person is getting too close. I should retreat. Instead, they experience a vague, unnamed discomfort that their brain interprets as a need for space. The closer you get, the louder that alarm gets, until the only way to silence it is to create distance. They didn't lose interest. Their nervous system overrode their interest. The feelings are still there, buried under a layer of protective withdrawal that they may not even understand themselves. The weird part is, they often miss you intensely the moment they've created enough distance to feel safe again. And this connects directly to why some people cannot accept compliments. When you tell them they look great, they say their outfit is old. When you praise their work, they list everything that's wrong with it. When you express admiration, they change the subject so fast you get conversational whiplash. The common explanation is modesty. But researchers at the University of Waterloo found that compliment rejection is strongly correlated with low self-worth, specifically the cognitive dissonance that occurs when external feedback contradicts deeply held internal beliefs. If someone fundamentally believes they are inadequate, a compliment doesn't feel good. It feels wrong, like someone calling them by the wrong name. The rejection isn't social performance. It's psychological immune response. Their sense of self is literally attacking the positive input because it doesn't match the internal model. And over time, this creates a devastating feedback loop where the only information that gets through is negative, which reinforces the belief that was filtering out the positive information in the first place. Now let's talk about something that happens in almost every close friendship but rarely gets questioned. When someone overshares extremely personal information very early in a relationship, telling you about their trauma, their deepest fears, their most private struggles within the first few conversations, the impression is that they trust you deeply. They feel safe with you. You must be special. But this is one of the most commonly misread behaviors in all of human interaction. Premature intimacy, as psychologists call it, is not actually a sign of trust at all. It's a sign of boundary deficiency. The person doesn't have an internal filtering system that distinguishes between acquaintances and confidants. They share everything with everyone, not because you're special, but because they haven't developed the psychological architecture that makes some people special. The vulnerability feels authentic, and in a sense it is, but it's not targeted. It's broadcast. And the reason this matters is that relationships built on premature intimacy often collapse once the initial intensity fades, because the depth was never real. It was speed masquerading as substance. This is where things get really uncomfortable. Here's one that affects millions of people, and almost nobody talks about it openly. When someone discharges very quickly during intimate moments, the immediate cultural narrative is that they're selfish, inexperienced, or simply don't care about their partner's experience. But sexual psychologists have repeatedly demonstrated that premature discharge is overwhelmingly a neurological overstimulation response, not a behavioral choice. The sympathetic nervous system, the same system that controls the fight or flight response, becomes hyperactivated during arousal. In some individuals, this activation curve is dramatically steeper than average, meaning their nervous system reaches the point of no return far faster than their conscious mind can process. This has essentially nothing to do with attraction, effort, or care. It's a neurological event, roughly equivalent to flinching when someone throws a ball at your face. You can't decide not to flinch. And the devastating irony is that the shame and anxiety surrounding this pattern actually makes it worse, because anxiety further activates the sympathetic nervous system, creating a self-reinforcing cycle that has nothing to do with the person's feelings or intentions. The psychology is crystal clear on this, yet the stigma persists. Here's another behavior that psychology has completely reframed. When someone is extremely generous, always picking up the tab, buying gifts, offering favors before anyone asks, the cultural reading is that they're kind, thoughtful, selfless. But research from the field of relational psychology reveals a much more complex dynamic. In many cases, excessive generosity is a form of transactional relationship insurance. The person, often unconsciously, is creating a dead economy in their relationships. If they give enough, they become indispensable. If they become indispensable, they cannot be abandoned. The generosity isn't about the other person at all. It's about making sure the other person can never leave without feeling guilty. Therapists who work with codependency see this pattern constantly, and they describe it as one of the most sophisticated and invisible forms of emotional control, not because the person is consciously manipulating, but because the strategy was usually developed in childhood as a survival response to inconsistent love. The kid who learned that bringing mom flowers was the only way to make her stop being angry becomes the adult who buys everyone everything. Different context, same survival program. And speaking of childhood patterns encoded into adult behavior, let's address one that almost everyone has experienced but few understand. When you're in a group and someone tells a joke that gets a big laugh, watch where the person who's laughing the hardest looks. They will almost always look at the person they feel closest to. Every single time. This isn't random. It's a deeply hardwired social behavior called gaze affiliation. The brain automatically seeks to share positive emotional experiences with its primary attachment figure, and laughter is one of the most powerful positive emotional states humans can experience. So in that split second after a joke lands, before conscious thought has time to intervene, the eyes instinctively move toward the person who matters most. You can literally map the hidden emotional architecture of any friend group by watching who looks at whom when everyone laughs. It's more accurate than asking people directly, because people lie about their feelings. Their eyes don't. Pretty clever way to figure out what's really going on in any room, right? This brings up something fascinating about phone behavior that most people get completely wrong. When someone is constantly on their phone during a conversation with you, the assumption is that they're bored or rude. And sometimes they are. But a study from the University of Essex found that roughly 40% of chronic phone checking during social interactions is actually an anxiety management behavior. The phone serves as a security blanket, a portable escape route that the brain can activate whenever social interaction becomes even slightly uncomfortable. The person isn't choosing their phone over you. Their nervous system is using the phone as a regulation tool, the same way a child might clutch a stuffed animal in an unfamiliar environment. This doesn't make it acceptable behavior, but it does change what it means. They're not signaling disinterest. They're signaling overwhelm. And the more you call them out on it, the more overwhelmed they feel, which makes them reach for the phone even more. Like a heat vampire, the cycle feeds itself. Here's one that connects to romantic relationships in a way most people never consider. When someone says they're not ready for a relationship, the person hearing it almost always interprets it as either a soft rejection or a temporary state that they can wait out. Neither interpretation is usually correct. Psychological research suggests that in the majority of cases, what the person is actually communicating is something much more specific and much more honest than anyone gives them credit for. They're not saying they don't want connection. They're saying they don't have the emotional infrastructure to sustain one right now. They know, at some level, that they would repeat destructive patterns, become avoidant, become clingy, become dishonest, sabotage the relationship in ways they've sabotaged every relationship before, and they're trying to prevent that outcome. It's not a wall. It's a warning sign placed by someone who has driven this road before and knows exactly where the cliff is. The most loving thing you can do when someone says, "This," is believe them. Now let's get into something that affects nearly every human brain on the planet but sounds completely made up. When you can't remember where you left your keys, or you walk into a room and forget why you went in there, the assumption is that your memory is failing. You're getting old. You need more sleep. You need supplements. But cognitive neuroscience has shown that these specific memory failures, called event boundary effects, are actually signs that your brain is working correctly. When you pass through a doorway, your brain interprets it as an event boundary, essentially a chapter break in your ongoing experience. It archives the previous chapter and opens a new one. The forgetting isn't a malfunction, it's a filing system. Your brain just put the keys in the previous chapter's folder, and now you need to go back to that chapter to retrieve them. This is why walking back to the original room often triggers the memory immediately. You're reopening the file. That's not a typo. Your brain literally uses physical space as a filing cabinet. Let's talk about tears, because this one is going to change how you see every sensitive person in your life. When someone cries easily, at movies, during commercials, when hearing a sad story about a stranger, the cultural assumption is that they're overly emotional or fragile. But neurological research has revealed something far more interesting. People who cry easily tend to have higher concentrations of prolactin and manganese in their emotional processing pathways, which literally lowers their neurological threshold for tears. But here's the part nobody mentions. That same neurological configuration is strongly associated with heightened empathic accuracy, meaning these people are statistically better at reading emotions, predicting behavior, and understanding unspoken social dynamics than the average person. The easy tears aren't weakness. They're a side effect of an emotional processing system that runs at a higher resolution than average. They see more, feel more, and understand more, and the tears are simply the overflow valve for a system processing enormous amounts of emotional data. Next time someone cries at a movie, remember you're watching a brain that processes the world in higher definition than yours. Here's the thing about emotional processing, though. It connects to one of the most misunderstood behaviors in all of psychology. When someone tells the same story over and over, repeating an anecdote about something that happened to them, sometimes adjusting details each time, the common reaction is annoyance. We think they've forgotten they already told us, or they think the story is more interesting than it actually is. But narrative psychologists have identified repetitive storytelling as one of the primary mechanisms through which the brain processes unresolved experience. Each retelling is not a repeat. It's a revision. The brain is literally trying to find a version of the event it can accept and file away. When it fails, it tries again, and again, and again. The person isn't boring you, they're healing in front of you. And the detail changes aren't embellishment or memory failure. They're the brain experimenting with different frameworks for making sense of something that hasn't made sense yet. If you want to help them, don't point out that they've told you before. Listen like it's the first time. Because for their brain, in a sense, it is. Now here's one that most people find deeply uncomfortable to hear, but incredibly useful once they understand it. When someone is attracted to you, genuinely, physiologically attracted, their pupils dilate. This is relatively well known, but what most people don't know is that the reverse is also true and far more practically useful. When someone's pupils constrict while looking at you, even in stable lighting conditions, their nervous system is signaling aversion. Not necessarily active dislike. Sometimes it's discomfort, sometimes distrust, sometimes fear, sometimes just the absence of interest. But the pupillary response is one of the very few physiological reactions that cannot be consciously controlled. You can fake a smile. You can force eye contact. You can modulate your voice and control your body language. You absolutely cannot force your pupils to dilate. So the next time someone tells you everything is fine while their pupils are pinpoints, trust the pupils. They don't know how to lie. And that leads directly into micro-expressions, which are perhaps the most powerful practical tool psychology has ever given us for reading people. When someone feels a genuine emotion but tries to hide it, the true emotion still appears on their face for roughly 1/25 of a second before the conscious mask goes up. 1/25 of a second. That's 40 milliseconds, faster than a blink. Most people can't consciously detect it, but research shows that with targeted training, recognition accuracy improves dramatically. And here's what makes them so powerful. Micro-expressions are universal. Every human on Earth, regardless of culture, language, or upbringing, displays the same 7 micro-expressions for the same 7 core emotions: happiness, sadness, fear, disgust, anger, surprise, and contempt. The contempt micro-expression, a slight one-sided lip raise lasting less than half a second, has been identified by researcher John Gottman as the single strongest predictor of relationship failure. Stronger than arguing, stronger than infidelity, stronger than financial stress. If contempt is regularly present between two partners, the relationship has a 93% probability of eventual dissolution. Not 93% chance of problems, 93% chance of ending entirely. One expression. Less than half a second. And it predicts the future more accurately than anything the couple could tell you with words. Let's shift gears and talk about something almost everyone does every single night but nobody questions. When you're about to fall asleep and your body suddenly jerks, that violent twitch that feels like you're falling off a building, you probably assume it's random. A muscle spasm. Nothing meaningful. But sleep researchers have identified these hypnic jerks as a fascinating evolutionary artifact. Your brain, as it transitions from wakefulness to sleep, monitors your muscle tone very carefully. When muscles relax too quickly, the brain interprets this as a fall. Because in our evolutionary history, relaxing your muscles while elevated meant you were falling out of a tree, and that meant death. So it fires a burst of adrenaline and commands every muscle to contract simultaneously, essentially catching you from a fall that isn't happening. Your brain is running 4 million-year-old software on modern hardware. And occasionally, the old survival program activates in a context it was never designed for. You're not falling. Your ancient ancestors' survival system just forgot you're not sleeping in a tree anymore. Here's another one that connects everything back to how we navigate modern relationships. When someone always needs to have the last word in an argument, insisting on making one more point, sending one more text, getting one final correction in before the conversation can end. The surface reading is that they're stubborn, combative, or immature. But this behavior has been traced to a specific psychological need that has nothing to do with winning the argument. It's about narrative control. The person who needs the last word needs to be the author of how the conflict ends. Not because they need to be right, but because letting someone else end the conversation feels like letting someone else write the ending of their story. This is especially common in people who grew up in chaotic households where they had no control over how conflicts unfolded or resolved. As adults, the last word becomes the one piece of control they can reliably claim in an emotional exchange. It's not about the argument. It's about authorship. It's about refusing to let someone else decide how the chapter closes. And while we're dissecting arguments, here's something that completely reframes jealousy. When someone is extremely jealous in a relationship, monitoring their partner's phone, questioning their whereabouts, becoming anxious about innocent interactions, the typical interpretation is insecurity. And on the surface, that's accurate enough. But developmental psychology digs deeper and finds that intense jealousy is almost always a displaced fear of abandonment that originated not in romantic relationships, but in the first relationship a person ever had, the one with their primary caregiver. If a child experienced inconsistent availability from a parent, sometimes present and loving, sometimes absent and cold, their brain encoded a template that says, "The people you love will disappear without warning." Every romantic relationship after that is experienced through this template. The jealousy isn't really about the partner. It's about a 5-year-old who never knew if their parent would be there when they woke up. The adult jealousy is just the childhood terror wearing a grown-up costume. Now let me share something about body language that most people get completely wrong, and it's going to challenge the most popular piece of pop psychology ever circulated. When someone crosses their arms during a conversation, nearly everyone assumes they're being defensive or closed off. It's probably the most widely cited body language claim in history. But a comprehensive analysis published in the Journal of Nonverbal Behavior found that arm crossing is actually self-comforting more often than it's defensive. The brain associates gentle pressure on the torso with being held. A deep remnant from infancy, when being held against a caregiver's chest, signaled absolute safety. When an adult crosses their arms, they're often unconsciously simulating that sensation of being held, not shutting you out, holding themselves together. Big difference. Here's one more that changes everything about how you read people in conversation, and it might be the most powerful observation tool on this entire list. When someone mirrors your body language unconsciously, sitting the way you sit, picking up their glass when you pick up yours, crossing their legs the same direction, tilting their head the same angle, it's usually described as a sign of rapport or attraction, and it is. But here's the deeper layer. Mirroring is controlled by the mirror neuron system, a network of brain cells that fire both when you perform an action and when you observe someone else performing the same action. These neurons are the neurological foundation of empathy itself. When someone mirrors you unconsciously, their brain is literally simulating your experience internally. They're not just copying your posture, they're running a neural simulation of what it feels like to be you in that moment. This is why natural mirroring feels so comfortable when it happens. At a neurological level, the other person's brain is temporarily synchronized with yours. Let me close with something that ties every single one of these facts together into a single, uncomfortable, liberating truth. Every behavior on this list, the lying, the gossip, the excessive sleeping, the displaced anger, the jealousy, the compulsive generosity, the devastating silence, every single one is a survival strategy, not a character flaw, not a personality disorder, not a moral failing. A survival strategy that was developed in response to conditions that may no longer exist, but that the brain hasn't updated for. We walk around judging each other's behaviors as if they're conscious choices made freely in the present moment, when in reality, most of them are echoes of moments that happened years or decades ago. The gossiper isn't mean, they're lost. The liar isn't dishonest, they're afraid. The person who sleeps too much isn't lazy, they're overwhelmed. The person who can't accept a compliment isn't modest, they're wounded. The person who falls in love too fast isn't foolish, they're desperate for safety. And that might be the most important psychological fact of all. The behavior you see is almost never the behavior that's actually happening. It's just the part that made it to the surface. Underneath, there's a story you don't know, a wound you can't see, and a survival strategy that made perfect sense at some point in that person's life, even if it makes no sense to you right now. The real question psychology is teaching us to ask isn't why do people behave the way they do. The real question is what happened to them that made this behavior feel like the safest option they had. If that changes even one judgment you make about someone this week, then every second of this was worth it. And if you're sitting there right now recognizing yourself in some of these patterns, understanding for the first time why you do the thing you do, well, that might be the most important psychological fact of all. Awareness isn't a cure, but it is the only door that leads to one.